This is Catonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Catonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm Breach Burke, and our subject this week is not going to appear to be a dark feminine figure at all, but rather we are going to talk about the Virgin Mary. Now, this is a podcast I am doing by request. We had talked about Mary Magdalene in the last one, and one of my Patreon subscribers had asked me if we could talk about the dark aspects of the Virgin Mary, or at least the dark feminine aspects when it related to her and to her background. And I thought that was a rather interesting subject. So we're going to talk about the Virgin Mary. We're going to talk about her appearances in the Bible, which there's not quite as many as you might think. And we're going to talk about what's happened with her as far as her being this kind of, she becomes this symbol of kind of purity and chastity and obedience. But nonetheless, she is probably the feminine figure that is closest to being deified within the Catholic Church, at least. And there are certainly other faiths that are part of the monotheistic tradition. And then, of course, we also have the Baha'i faith that also venerate Mary. Less venerated, I think, in Protestantism for reasons that will probably become obvious. But it's very interesting how the Mother of Jesus has become the archetype of the mother, the Virgin Mother in particular. So what we're going to do here when we're talking about the Virgin Mary is we're gonna have to look at this from a number of different angles, and I'm going to try not to make this podcast go on for too long, but we definitely need to talk about the element of the virgin birth, which is not unique to Christianity. When we talk about Mary as being, a virgin, and then she's the Annunciation, where she is the Lord has made her pregnant with the Messiah or with the Savior, or however we look at it. Mary is the one who, she says, that she accepts this, and this is her act of obedience for because the social reasons behind a woman who is a virgin who is pregnant. And again, this Mary is not the only one who suffers from this. In terms of mythological or religious stories. Certainly we see this of priestesses who are supposed to be chaste, who become pregnant. One good example is Rhea Silvia, who is the one who is supposedly impregnated by Mars and gives birth to the twins Romulus and Remus, who end up becoming the founders of Rome. And of course, Romulus kills his brother, and Rome ends up being named after him. But there's this idea of this divine origin. So you will have these women who are chaste, or they're sacred, or they're serving some kind of a pious or sacred role, which in some way is supposed to make them the perfect vessel to carry the divinity. But as we're going to see, the whole idea of the virgin birth goes back quite a ways. So again, this is and very likely it's come into Christianity through some of these other traditions. Nonetheless, if we still examine the Mary as an individual, Mary as the mother of Jesus, and her role in the Bible, we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at those things, and then we're going to talk about the role that has developed for her in Christianity, right up into the dogma of the Assumption, which comes much later. We get to around Pope Pius XII in the Catholic Church, who talks about the idea of Mary as being bodily assumed into heaven. Yeah, and of course that's going to be connected to the miracle of Fatima, which is what they call the miracle of the sun, which we will also talk about at the end. But I think archetypally speaking, to talk about the Virgin Mary is to talk about her. We're going to talk about elements of the mother archetype. And we're also going to look at, some of the images of her Because as we know, the mother archetype is something that is, or at least if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know that the mother archetype certainly has, while it has its nurturing kinds of qualities, it also can have its dark and devouring ones as well. But what does she sort of represent here? How can we look at her as she has this image of chastity and obedience, but there's also a darker version of the Virgin Mary, and we're going to be looking at something called the Toledat Yeshu, which is this discussion of the Virgin Mary, this kind of darker element of her. And of course, we also need to talk to some degree, at least, about the idea of the Black Madonna. Now, I had a separate podcast on that at one time. It was actually an interview with Ellen Jones, who had been doing a lot of work around the Black Madonna, but that podcast, unfortunately, has gotten lost because the lost sound quality, and then it ended up being deleted, and it was one of the files that I was not able to save. So, in any case, let's dive in, and we're going to start, I think, with the idea of the dying and resurrecting vegetation god. That's the place where we want to start with this. Now, initially, when you have the idea of this divine child, okay, the idea of the divine child, and of course, you also have this myth of death and resurrection, which doesn't always, by the way, connect in with the divine child myth. But Jesus, of course, is a prime example of the divine child myth. There's other ones. There's the god Horus in Egyptian mythology. There's Perseus, the hero who slays Medusa. There's many other ones. There's a mythology of the hero that is it really is a very patriarchal mythology, and it does follow the trajectory of psychological development in humans, at least the way it was always assumed to be. Now, the way that our culture is changing and the way that we are thinking about things, this may not be a path that could be assumed, but the idea of the divine child is that they are born, they become kind of a threat to some kind of a male figure, a king, a father, an uncle. There's somebody to whom the child is a threat, and so the child is exiled in some way. Either the parents have to flee with the child, the mother puts the child in a basket or puts it somewhere else and sends it down the river. Case of Perseus, mother and child get thrown into a chest and thrown into the sea. There's all of these things, but the divine child has some kind of sacred lineage. They have some kind of they have a parent who is considered to be holy or is considered to be divine. At least one parent there is an immortal. And in some cases, I think, you do have goddesses who are the mothers of heroes. And again, Aeneas in the Roman myth is a good example because his mother is Aphrodite or Venus, and his father is a mortal man, Anchises. So that kind of flips the script a little bit. But for the most part, it's usually a woman, and it could be a woman who has either extraordinary beauty, or perhaps she is of royal status, or perhaps she, is somebody who is young and virginal, and the god, comes upon her, and she, gets pregnant. Socially speaking, you have to wonder about some of these stories where these, the cover-ups. If you're talking about a priestess who has taken certain vows where she's not permitted to have intercourse for whatever reason, is this a case of, oh no, I actually didn't have intercourse. The god came upon me and I just became with child. People have talked about that kind of an idea. But I think there's something more behind the archetype. I don't know that these, of course, mythological stories are not ones we're supposed to take literally anyway. They're not history. Although the Jesus story is a bit unique in that we view it as a piece of history. But it's really a mythologized piece of history. Again, if we accept the existence of Jesus Christ, if we say that, yes, the evidence points to the fact that there was a man called Jesus who, was kind of, a thorn in the side of the Pharisees, and eventually was, considered to be a kind of criminal arrested by the Roman government, but that he, was considered to bring about this kind of new religion, new way of thinking, either a prophet or a messiah, or however he's thought of, the Son of God, however he's thought of. All the stories about him and his birth are mythologizations. They connect in, as I have mentioned in previous podcasts, with the myth of Dionysus, okay, or Bacchus, who was very highly venerated in Rome around this time. So the idea that the Bacchus myth, and maybe even to some extent there's a discussion of the Mithras myth and some of the other ones who get kind of, there's little bits and pieces of these different religious systems, liturgies, and things like that get mixed into early Christianity and have become part of what we think of as early Orthodox Christianity. So, so the story is it's more like, this is almost like another version of the Dionysus myth, because Dionysus is the first deity to be viewed as a kind of savior figure. He was, the stories of Jesus parallel him. There's the idea that he dies and that, it's actually Athena and Zeus that save his heart and then resurrect him. There's all kinds of things. His connection to wine. Jesus' first myth, which we're going to talk about with Mary, is the wedding feast at Cana, where he turns water into wine. This is a feature of Dionysus. I mean, at the Linnea festival, it is said that in his temple, the water flowing into the temple turns into wine. So, yeah, and there's dozens of other examples, but you can listen to the Dionysus podcast. I do actually go over a lot of that over there. The idea, though, is that, when we talk about the idea of the virgin birth, this is one of the features of the hero myth. I mean, the female who is involved in conception, there's going to be something exceptional about her in this way, or something miraculous or something sacred. And, the myth of the dying and resurrecting God, I mean, initially it starts with, like, Cybele and Attis, the idea of when Attis is killed, resurrecting, Attis through, basically his blood is turned into flowers. Similarly with the myth of Adonis, when he is killed at a boar hunt, Aphrodite mourns him and turns his blood into I'm trying to remember which kind of flower it was. One of them was violets. One of them was, some of them are actually named for themselves, for them, like might even be an Adonis flower. I can't remember, but basically they are vegetation gods. In other words, they, when they are killed, they resurrect as the life of the fields. And you could see this in some of these harvest rituals where you have the idea, like John Barleycorn, for instance, where you have this, the wheat or the corn or whatever, this deity that's represented by this. It's the life of the fields, and it has to be cut down in order to, bring life to the rest of the people. And probably the whole ideas of Eucharist are very much connected into this. There's the sacrificial, this particular life. And really, if you want to get very literal about it, plant life is life, I mean, we always think about animals as being life. Well, I eat plants, I don't eat animals, but plants are also life. So it gets cut down and in order for us to have the sustenance or the food from those things, and then of course it comes back again the next year. So it dies and it's resurrected. So it takes on a kind of mystical aura in and of itself. So you have to think about this as the context for the Jesus story and the idea of the virgin birth. The idea of the virgin birth could also have to do with, if you want to think about this in terms of vegetation gods, about the idea that, it's not like you have to, seeds are planted in the earth, but the earth is considered to be feminine, and things just kind of grow naturally. I mean, there's not, even though there is kind of a seeding that's going on, it's not like that's necessarily, I don't know if that's always quite viewed as a masculine element. It's almost like the earth kind of produces it on her own. Like she is just the mother that naturally produces things. So anyway, that's a possible angle you could take, but certainly that mythology and the mythology of the divine child, the heroic divine child, is part of this. Otto Rank has a whole discussion of this as connected to Freud's Oedipus complex. because there's this idea of this child who sees himself as, these are not my real parents. I have divine parents, and I'm sort of in this, the first time that the parents tend to lose their divine status with the child. And it's part of the Oedipus complex, because it's when the son comes into contention with the father, and his affection is for the mother. There's that's very oversimplified, and when we talk about the Oedipus complex, we tend to talk about it in a very simplified way. But it is a little bit more complex than that in terms of the way in which we relate to people and objects and situations that bring us that kind of security, or bring us back to the idea of home, or of mother, or of nourishment or safety. So there's a lot of that's a whole side subject that one could get into. But this heroic figure always grows up to do something important, and goes through some kind of a crisis, and either has a battle or a sacrifice or something like that. And in the end, they bring back the treasure for the community. And in Jesus's case, he has his mission, he is put to death, and then he's resurrected. It's like he's not just simply the hero, he's not the hero who's out doing battle per se, but he is the one who is resurrected after death, but his sacrifice is like the sacrifice of the fields. It's like, okay, this is the thing that provides nourishment, or provides spiritual nourishment. So so we see this as fitting into a heroic mythological theme. We see it as in this dying and resurrecting vegetation god. And Dionysus is a vegetation god. He is the god of wine, so therefore he is the god of the grapevine. So this is all connected in. Okay, so that's kind of the broader strokes of the mythology of virgins and virgin births. Okay, and the mother tends to be someone very exceptional. And in many cases, she is a virgin because she's not impregnated by a human man. She's impregnated by a deity. So that's looking at it in more of a mythological context. In a social sense, Mary's pregnancy would have been viewed as something, it would have been outside of the social norm. For a woman to be married to a man and to be pregnant, in fact, Joseph, I believe, who was her husband, is said to be a widower. And Joseph, of course, at least in one version of the Gospels, isn't going to marry her until, of course, God comes to him, or sends an angelic messenger and tells him, no, this is a divine child, and, you should marry her, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so there's definitely the social aspect of it would be that if you just took it at face value, if somebody showed up and said, well, I'm pregnant, and, and I have never known man, then, people would either be skeptical of that, or, perhaps in a society that would accept such things, or perhaps had some other kind of evidence that they regarded as, being proof of that particular thing. Socially, this kind of puts Mary in a category of someone who would appear to not be following the rules, right? She's the one who, the woman who's pregnant out of wedlock, right? But in this case, the idea is that she is actually a virgin. And this creates some interesting issues when we think about the way in which virginity is conceived of in our culture. Like, virginity is considered to be the highest value in a woman. It's not her mind, it's not her talents, it's not other things. It's whether or not that part of her part of her anatomy is intact. And it's almost like that's new versus used, right? I mean, and unfortunately, you hear things kind of spoken about that way. And again, a lot of this has to do with bride prices, like a woman who had already been married, or who had already perhaps had a child in some circumstances, was somehow, treated like she was like used up or something. You see a lot of this talk even today in like abstinence education courses, where they talk about a girl who's had sex as a used piece of tape or something, which is it's all just kind of ridiculous and a bit odious, but when you have this image, when you start to take Mary as an image of a real person who was actually a virgin who gave birth, then it's almost like it raises, if you want to look at it on the social function of religion, it like raises the bar for women about with regard to their level of purity, or the quality of the child. You know what I mean? Like, she's giving birth to a child that is exceptional in all of these ways. So yeah, interesting background to think about there. And also, just thinking about her with respect to just one more thing on the Dionysus theme is the idea that she is probably a lot like Semele, who was the mother of, at least in one version, she's the mother of Dionysus, and as so she was a priestess, and she said she became pregnant. I think she might have actually been a priestess of the goddess Hera, who's actually the wife of Zeus, and Zeus is the one who impregnated Semele. And she tells this old woman, who's Hera in disguise, that she thinks, a god came upon her because now she's pregnant. And Hera says to her, "Oh, that's probably just some guy. Next time you see him, you ask him to show that he's really a god. He's probably just taking you for a ride." And of course, she's, nervous now because, if it's a child of if it's a god, then, ooh, that's okay. But if it's just some regular guy who's duped her, then, ooh, that's not good. So, of course, that's a trick, because when Zeus shows his true form to her, she burns up. Okay. And but when she goes to the underworld, Dionysus goes to the underworld and resurrects her and brings her up to heaven. Important note there, because one of the doctrines related to the Virgin Mary is that she is brought up bodily into heaven, just like Semele was with Dionysus. Okay. So, okay, let's get away from mythology and let's go into the biblical stuff. So I'm going to bring up some notes here. Okay, so where do we see her? Now, her name, of course, is Mary, or the Aramaic is transliterated as Miriam, usually, or Maryam. Maryam, with the am at the end. And it's the English name Mary is from the Greek Maria, which is a shortened form of another name. And those names do appear in the New Testament, at least in the Greek version of it. So it says, Mary's commonly referred to as the Virgin Mary in accordance with belief that the Holy Spirit impregnated her, thereby conceiving her firstborn son, Jesus, miraculously without sexual relations with her betrothed Joseph, until her son Jesus was born. So, yeah, that's the other thing. The big question is, did she remain a virgin? There's some differences of opinion, because it is said that Jesus had brothers, but were the brothers from Joseph's previous marriage with a wife who had passed away, or were they his children with Mary? So it's not entirely clear. Now, says the three main titles for Mary used by the Orthodox. Okay, so this would be Eastern Orthodox Church. So Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox is Theotokos, which is the God-bearer. And not sure if I'm going to say the first part of this right, i.e. Parthenos, which basically means ever virgin, and Panagia, which means all holy. So those are the titles that tend to be used for her. And of course, the doctrine of whether or not Mary was actually a virgin, it varies depending. Different traditions, like I said, the Orthodox see her as the God-bearer, but they don't see her as, they don't necessarily see her in the same light that the Catholics do. She is, the way that they talk about her here, it says some Marian titles have a direct scriptural basis. For instance, the title Queen Mother has been given to Mary, as she was mother of Jesus, referred to as the King of Kings, due to his ancestral descent from King David. Okay, so let's jump into what's in the New Testament. It says the canonical Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles are the primary sources of historical info about Mary. They are almost contemporary sources, as the Synoptic Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles are considered to date from around the years 66 to 90 in the Common Era, whereas the Gospel of John dates from somewhere between 90 and 110 CE. It's much later. These are all many years after Jesus would have died. They provide limited information about Mary, as they primarily focus on the teaching of Jesus and on his apostles. The reliability of the Gospels historically and of the Acts are subject to debate. So, so basically, the Acts of the Apostles and the Gospels are the primary sources for what we know about Mary. Now, I understand that the oldest is actually the Galatians letter, Paul's letter to Galatians 4:4, and it says which it says that she is referred to as a woman and is not named. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law. So this is the first reference to her without using her name. Where she's referred to, the Gospel of Luke mentions her the most often, calling her name 12 times. But all of these in the narrative of Jesus' infancy, which is Luke 1:27 to 2:34. Matthew mentions her 5 times, 4 of these in the narrative of Jesus' birth and infancy, and once Matthew 13:55 outside the infancy narrative. Okay. Mark names her once, Mark 6:3, and mentions Jesus' mother without naming her in Mark 3:31 to 32. Gospel of John refers to the mother of Jesus twice, but never mentions her name. She's first seen at the wedding feast of Cana, okay, which is John chapter 2, 1 through 12. And it's interesting how John kind of has this more Dionysian flavor here. He also tends to have the Gospel of John is quite different from the other ones, but I won't digress into that. The second reference has her standing near the cross of Jesus with Mary Magdalene, Mary of Clopas, and her own sister, who is possibly the same as Mary of Clopas. The wording is semantically ambiguous, along with the disciple whom Jesus loved. And it's the only text in the canonical Gospels which the adult Jesus has a conversation with Mary. He does not address her as mother, but as woman. In Koine Greek, the language of the Gospel of John was composed in, calling one mother woman was not disrespectful and could even be tender. Accordingly, in some versions of the Bible, translated as dear woman. Okay, so in the Acts of the Apostles, Mary's and the brothers of Jesus are mentioned in the company of the 11 apostles who were gathered in the upper room after the ascension of Jesus. And in Revelation, the woman clothed with the sun, the woman clothed with the sun is sometimes identified as Mary. So it says, in terms of her genealogy, it says Gospel of Matthew gives a genealogy by his father's paternal line, only identifying Mary as the wife of Joseph. John 19:25 states that Mary had a sister. Jerome identifies Mary of Clopas as the sister of Mary, mother of Jesus. And according to the early 2nd century historian Hegesippus, Mary of Clopas was likely Mary's sister-in-law, understanding that Clopas had to have been Joseph's brother. According to the writer of Luke, Mary was a relative of Elizabeth, wife of the priest Zechariah, of the priestly division of Abijah, who was herself part of the lineage of Aaron, and so the tribe of Levi. Some believe that those relationship with Elizabeth was on the maternal side, believe that Mary, like Joseph, was of the royal Davidic line, and so the tribe of Judah, and that the genealogy of Jesus presented in Luke 3 from Nathan is in fact the genealogy of Mary, while the genealogy from Solomon given in Matthew 1 is that of Joseph. Okay, and Aaron's wife Elisheba was one of the tribe of Judah, so all their descendants are from Levi and Judah. So there's this attempt to put Mary as part of a royal line in her own right, and Joseph as well, giving them this kind of connection to royal lineage. And incidentally, by the way, this is another thing that tended to happen in the ancient mythologies, where if you had a king, or you had a tribal king, his lineage was always connected, not only to great heroes, but also to potentially divine parentage as well. So this is something that is, again, this indication, this attempt to link Jesus to a royal line of Judah or of Israel is definitely in practice at that time with any figure of any importance, like trying to show their royal connection and perhaps their divine connection, thus giving them, it's kind of like their credentials or their references, like saying like, hey, this is not just some regular guy, this is somebody important, right? Okay, so now the first thing that we talk about with Mary is the Annunciation, and this is when Archangel Gabriel comes and tells her that she is about to that she is with child. So it says Mary resided in her own house in Nazareth in Galilee, possibly with her parents, during her betrothal. The first stage of a Jewish marriage, Jewish girls are considered marriageable at the age of 12 and 6 months, though the actual age of the bride varied with circumstances. Okay. The marriage was preceded by the betrothal, after which the bride legally belonged to the bridegroom, though she did not live with him till about a year later when the marriage was celebrated. Angel Gabriel announced to her that she was to be the mother of the promised Messiah by conceiving him through the Holy Spirit, and after initially expressing incredulity at the announcement, she responded, "I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be done unto me according to your word." Joseph planned to quietly divorce her, but was told her conception was by the Holy Spirit in a dream by an angel of the Lord. The angel told him not to hesitate to take her as his wife, which Joseph did, thereby formally completing the wedding rites. Since Gabriel had told Mary that Elizabeth, having previously been barren, was then miraculously pregnant, Mary hurried to see Elizabeth, who was living with her husband Zechariah in the hill country in the city of Judah. Mary arrived and greeted Elizabeth, who called Mary the mother of my Lord, and Mary spoke the words of praise that later became known as the Magnificat, from her first words in the Latin version. After about 3 months, Mary returned to her own house. Okay, so there's this whole narrative about Mary and how she, the angel Gabriel comes to her, and of course he is one of the main archangels, and announces to her that she is to give birth to, now they're saying to the Messiah, okay, which of course is a very specifically Jewish title or iteration. And Messiah was typically understood in more of a warlike sense. It was more the idea that the Messiah would be some kind of a military leader who would, bring the Jewish people to victory over those who might conquer them or oppress them in some way. The idea of Jesus as being a Messiah or an anointed one, in the way that modern Christianity tends to think of it, is a result of what they call, there's a term in religious studies called routinization of charisma. And what this means is that when you have a founder of a religion who promises some kind of an imminent event, like the early Christians all believed that, Jesus' return was going to be imminent, and that somehow he was going to do something, like he was going to overthrow the Romans, or he was going to, do something that was going to liberate them, perhaps from aspects of rule of empire or something to that effect. And but of course, when he did not return, then it became, but actually, this is something different. And this is where, St. Paul starts to come in and some of the other writers to reinterpret and say, well, no, actually his death on the cross is a sacrifice. That's where the dying and resurrecting vegetation mythology ends up coming in. And then he becomes this sacrificial victim. Freud has a lot to say about that subject as well in his work Totem and Taboo, where the idea of the totem sacrifice either assuages guilt in some way or is a means of acquiring power. And in this case, this would be to ostensibly get rid of the guilt of original sin. Okay, so Mary is the one who gives birth to Jesus. So the first thing that we see is this Annunciation. We see this divine child. The birth of Jesus, it says, according to Luke, the decree of the Roman Emperor Augustus required that Joseph return to his hometown of Bethlehem to register for a census. While he was there with Mary, she gave birth to Jesus. Because there was no place for them in the inn, she used the manger as a cradle. Now, anybody who follows the Christmas story or Christmas songs, they know this. And it's interesting because, again, the birth of Jesus is placed around the 25th of December, which is in the middle of the festival of Saturnalia in Rome. And the idea of him being presented, or, what they call the Epiphany, that was also when the three magi were supposed to come, the three Zoroastrian priests who bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. That's on the Epiphany, which is around the 6th of January, the same as the Feast of Persephone, by the way, the other mother of Dionysus. So, yeah, you still have these parallels here. But more than likely, from the account that you read in the Bible, Jesus was probably born in the springtime. And that is those who follow more of the historical facts of the Bible, and including the idea of the star in the east and when astrologically that would have occurred. Jesus was probably born around April. And they think it might have actually been 7 years before the date usually attributed. I think it's 7 years. It's somewhere, in any case, it's definitely earlier than we think of as 0 CE, or the year 1 AD or CE, which is actually our whole ID system of years is measured by, it's called Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, when Jesus was born. And I use CE because that means Common Era, because not everybody views it that way, but strictly speaking, that is how it is counted. So when Jesus is born, now it's interesting because this is the point at which, now if you want to bring the hero myth into it, King Herod, when the three magi come and they go to the city, King Herod learns that there's another king who is born. So then he does the slaughter of the holy innocents. He slaughters all the firstborns in the area, and this is when Mary and Joseph have to flee to Egypt, okay, to avoid Jesus being killed. So this is where you see the beginning of hero mythology. Now, the boy was circumcised, named by Jewish law, named Jesus, or Yeshua, which means Yahweh is salvation. After Mary continued in the blood of her purifying for another 33 days, for a total of 40 days, according to Jewish law, she brought her burnt offering and sin offering to the temple in Jerusalem, Luke chapter 2, verse 22, so the priest could make atonement for her. Interesting how giving birth is regarded as a sin, but in any case. They also presented Jesus, as it is written in the law of the Lord, every male that openeth the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, Luke 2:23, and then there's a number of other places where this is said. After the prophecies of Simeon and the prophetess Anna in Luke, the family returned to Galilee, to their own city, Nazareth. Okay, so then we get into the story of the Magi. And it says, Mary is involved in the only event in Jesus' adolescent life that is recorded in the New Testament. At the age of 12, Jesus, having becoming separated from his parents on their return journey from the Passover celebration in Jerusalem, was found in the temple among the religious teachers. Okay, so this is the only other time, and of course Mary goes to retrieve him, and he is there astounding the scholars with his knowledge and understanding of Judaic law and so forth. So the next place that we see Mary is at the wedding feast of Cana. And it says, according to Epiphanius, Origen, and Eusebius, these brothers would be sons of Joseph from a previous marriage. So it said that she goes there with Jesus' brothers. So reading a sentence ahead here. And that's the position of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Or in some versions, according to Jerome, it would be Jesus' cousins. In any case, they go to this wedding feast together. And at that wedding feast, that's when there's not enough wine at the wedding, and Mary, implores upon Jesus to turn the water, into wine, so that there's enough wine. And of course, Jesus kind of makes a little admonishment or a comment about, it's not the time for him to begin his mission or to show things, but he does actually do it because his mother requests it. So we see Mary depicted at being present at the crucifixion of Jesus, standing near the disciple whom Jesus loved. And again, there's some controversy over who that is, along with Mary of Clopas and Mary Magdalene. And again, there's some other women there, but nonetheless, there's the idea that she is standing at the cross when he dies. After Jesus ascends in Acts chapter, first book of Acts, verses or Acts 1:12-26, it says, Mary is the only one other than the 11 apostles to be mentioned by name who abide in the upper room when they return from Mount Olivet. Her presence with the apostles during Pentecost is not explicit, though it has in fact been held as a fact by Christian tradition. Okay, so the Bible's not explicit on that, but that's the way it's understood. From this time, she disappears from the biblical accounts, although it's held by Catholics that she is portrayed as the heavenly woman in the book of Revelation. And it's interesting because this idea of this woman clothed with the sun, this interpretation feels a little bit like a later one. Whether or not that's really meant to be her, the idea that that woman is virginal perhaps is what connects her in. But yeah, but certainly by the time you get to the idea of Mary being bodily assumed into heaven and being treated as the queen of heaven, that certainly becomes the interpretation of Revelation. Though you could delve into the whole idea of the woman clothed with the sun and whether that's her or not, but again, that would be kind of a side note. Okay, so other places where Mary is mentioned. The apocryphal Gospel of James. She's the daughter of Joachim and Anne. Before Mary's conception, Anne had been barren and was far advanced in years. We see this also with Abraham and Sarah. In the Old Testament, there's this idea of the woman who's really old. And I think that's interesting that you have somebody who is a crone, who is barren, who suddenly becomes pregnant. In the way, it's almost like the converse of the virgin, the young virgin who becomes pregnant without intercourse. And then there's the idea of the old woman who's past childbearing years who becomes pregnant. Not either way, you're kind of almost talking about a miraculous kind of birth. It says, Mary was given to service as a consecrated virgin in the temple of Jerusalem when she was 3 years old. Okay, this is according to the Gospel of James, which is not part of it's not part of the biblical canon. This was in spite of the patent impossibility of its premise that a girl could be kept in the temple along with some companions. Yeah, that seems almost like that's confusing other Roman religions, perhaps like the Vestal Virgins, for example, who might have been kept in the temple in that kind of state. But in any case, that's what she is. That's the way she's described in the Gospel of James. And some unproven apocryphal accounts, such as the same one, state at the same time that her betrothal to Joseph, Mary, was 12 to 14 years old, and suggest that she was 16 during her pregnancy. Her age during pregnancy has varied up to 17 in apocryphal sources. And of course, these are historically unreliable. Well, truthfully, all the texts are historically unreliable if you want to really come down to it. But perhaps some have more are more easily verified than others. So, Hippolytus of Thebes says that Mary lived for 11 years after the death of her son, dying in year 41 AD or CE. So, okay, so now we have the this kind of background on Mary as she is mentioned in the Bible. Now, the dogmas on her, there's a lot of them. Certainly in Christian perspectives, there's a lot of diversity. It says Catholics and Eastern Orthodox have established Marian traditions. Protestants don't really pay attention because they don't pay attention to the Mary cult, the saint cult, because they think of all of those as being idolatrous in some way. Because they're only focused. Well, they're focused on Jesus. They tend to be more focused on the text, actually. Protestantism is a very rationalist form of Christianity, whereas Orthodox and Catholic liturgies tend to be more involved in the mystery, and therefore they are going to include the element of the divine feminine, which really, in the end of the day, is what Mary represents. She represents this element of the divine feminine. If he is the divine child, then she is the divine feminine that is connected to him. I mean, she may have been a human woman, but her, because of her, in a way, it's almost like her own heroic deeds. This is how she ends up taking this on. So it says, yes, Mary is accorded the title Blessed in recognition of her assumption to heaven and her capacity to intercede on behalf of those who pray to her. There is a difference between the usage of the term blessed as pertaining to Mary and its usage as pertaining to a beatified person. Blessed as a Marian title refers to her exalted state as being the greatest among the saints. For a person who has been declared beatified, blessed simply indicates they may be venerated despite not being canonized. Catholic teachings make clear that Mary is not considered divine, and prayers to her are not answered by her, but rather by God through her intercession. So she almost ends up assuming an angelic role in a way. She is an intermediary. She becomes a daemonic figure, and I say that in terms of the Greek word daemon, which means the one who intercedes between, either acts as a messenger or intercedes between humans and God. Now, it's interesting because, again, the dogma is that she is not divine. And there's a lot to be taken from that, because the idea that this feminine is present in heaven, that she does have the power, she has the power to move God to act on your behalf. That there are so many miracles attributed to the Virgin Mary. There's the praying of the Rosary, okay, which is an act of devotion to the Virgin Mary. It's the fact that she is a feminine that is able to intercede suggests that it's interesting. It's like she's an acceptable, cleansed, purified form of the feminine. So in editing this podcast, I'm interjecting this because I realized that I mentioned something at the very beginning that in the final version of this I did not include. So I'm going to interject it here after we are talking about Mary as one who intercedes, as this kind of model of feminine purity and obedience and submission. We're talking about Mary a little bit as a dark feminine figure, and it was mentioned a text known as the Toledot Yeshu, and I didn't really talk about that, which basically means the history of Jesus. Now, it's important to understand that this is a kind of a parody text, written probably around the same time as the Babylonian Talmud, and it talks about the Gospels in a kind of a Jewish, very anti-Christian kind of a parody. Now, according to the text I'm reading on this is just Wikipedia. Many versions exist of. There's no definitive version of this text. Many versions exist scattered across its numerous manuscripts throughout medieval Europe and the Middle East. Historians did not seriously study the Toledot Yeshu until the early 21st century, when its value in understanding late antique and medieval Jewish perspectives about Jesus and Christianity was realized. The Toledot both reflects the polemical and defensive contexts of many historical Jewish communities under Christian rule, as well as a source that fueled Christian hostility towards Judaism. Okay, so it says, in the Toledot Yeshu, Jesus is portrayed as an illegitimate child conceived from an adulterous rape. As a child, he is a troublemaker who stirs tension in the rabbinic study house. In his adulthood, he is depicted as a sorcerer who taught heretical Judaism, seduced women, and was defeated by Judas, and died a shameful death in a sewer. His tomb is robbed by a gardener, leading his followers to mistakenly believe he is risen from the dead. The Toledot accepts many miracles of Jesus, such as creating birds from clay, resurrecting the dead, and healing the blind, but attributes the ability of Jesus to do this being because of his magical prowess and sorcery instead of divinity. According to the Encyclopedia Judaica, the narrative in all versions of the Toledot treats Jesus as an exceptional person who, from his youth, demonstrated unusual wit and wisdom, but disrespect towards his elders and the sages of his age. So, yes, this is meant to be a parody. People, depending on how you feel about Jesus and the Gospels, you may take offense at something like this, or you may just simply see it as the parody that it is. Nonetheless, it may reveal, just as satire tends to today, a different perspective from those who did not embrace Christianity as the successor to Judaism. So in this, certainly the virginity of Mary is called into question in this particular account. But this is not particularly a seriously taken account. It does seem to be a parody, and in the way and style in which it's written, it could be telling us something about those who resent having Christian rule imposed upon them in the name of their own Messiah, perhaps. And it might also, potentially, this could also be a type of a text that was created in the name of Jews and perhaps meant to discredit Jews. I don't know. But either way, it does seem to be that there's various versions, again, from medieval Europe and throughout the Middle East. So this is a text that has been around since at least the medieval period. But what's interesting is that we also see in the veneration of Mary, as I mentioned earlier, the veneration of the Black Madonna. And when the Black Madonna is venerated, we see her in churches all over Europe. I want to say there's at least 100 Black Madonnas. And this seems to really, I think, get at the root of what Mary actually is. She is this, the black stone that a Black Madonna is made from is certainly connected to the black stones that you would see associated with Kibali worship. The word Kibali might roughly translate to black stone. there's a sense of an earth mother there, of again, if we're going to go back to the mother of the earth, the natural, the wild, the savage mother, the one who is there's the life of the fields, and that in order there's always the demand that the life of the fields be cut down in order for things to grow again. That is one of the things about life, is that life requires death. In order for you to live, you have to eat, and if you're going to eat, you have to kill something, whether it be animal or plant or whatever. We don't eat things, all these things are living things, and they have to die in order that other things might live. So Mary, so the Black Madonna has this deeper implication. I think it's also interesting that those black stones are used, like in India, if you walk into a Hindu temple, the murti are usually the main murti of the temple, which is the main image, which is then goes under a ritual to establish prana, or kind of like the essence of the god in the deity. It's different from saying, okay, this statue is a symbol that represents this god. It's like they actually imbue it with the essence of the god. But again, the term god is understood a bit differently in Hinduism than it is in Western religion. But these deities, everyone I have ever seen in a temple is usually made out of a black stone. Okay, it's this black image. And that blackness kind of gets to that mystery, that darkness of the divine feminine that is both creates and destroys. It's that mystery of life that is that can be sublimely wonderful and terrible at the same time. And so it's interesting that these images of Mary, they sort of come together, and you see them in these cathedrals. But there's also many places where that's, in a way, that aspect of her is almost sanitized out. She's often portrayed like in blue and white robes, and she's often portrayed as white, even though she most certainly wasn't, probably. And she's always like shown with her hands in prayer and her eyes bowed, like averted. Like she's showing her humility and her submission. But at the same time, she has this absolute tremendous power, and it creates this way of looking at the feminine in religion that I think is actually problematic, because you have this idea of this chaste, pure, unattainable, like there's this submission to the level of there's no she becomes this symbol of this ultimate symbol of submission and obedience, and there's the implication that this is the way in which women, achieve a connection to the divine. Now, the idea of submission in religion is certainly, like, actually the word Islam means surrender, okay? There is an element of surrendering to things rather than trying to take rational control. Certainly when you're talking about a feminine element, you're talking about something where you yield control. But yielding that control actually gives you more power. And that may be kind of the hidden thing that we're not really seeing in Mariology and in the things that are talked about. Because Mary actually has tremendous power from what we can see. There's so many devotions. I mean, I was raised Catholic. There's so many devotions and festivals to Mary. And, and she is... the different doctrines connected to her. There's the virgin birth. There's her as the mother of God. There's the idea of her as a perpetual virgin. There's the idea of the Immaculate Conception of Jesus. And then there's the idea of her being assumed into heaven, which, by the way, did not come about until 1950. And this idea of her as, being this Semele-like figure who's brought into heaven, and almost, she's not divine, but she's sort of almost given a type of divinity or kind of a divine role, even though she's technically not considered to be divine. And it's just interesting how there's this attempt to create that boundary, like, oh yes, she's very, very holy, oh, but she's not God. And this may in some way represent the idea that this kind of patriarchal religion subjugates the Earth Mother in some way. But that power of that Earth Mother is still there, and it's still very strong. So one of the things I think I want to talk about kind of in finishing up this discussion of Mary. I'm going to look at my notes to see if I've missed anything. But this thing about the miracle of the sun. Okay. Now, there are many miracles associated with the Virgin Mary, but the ones that we have seen in the 20th century, and there's other ones too. You can talk about Our Lady of Lourdes, and you can talk about there's other ones, but we're going to be talking about the ones at Fatima. And this was supposed to have occurred on the 13th of October, 1917, and this was in Portugal, in Fatima. And this was, there was 3 shepherd children. There was Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta. And she apparently appeared to these children, and she had told them certain secrets. And there was a prophecy connected to her that she was going to appear and perform miracles on a certain date. And the miracle that was said to occur, now there is a photograph, but the photograph is static and it doesn't really show anything. And some people say, oh, that means nothing interesting happened. Well, not necessarily. You know how it is, like if you see this really spectacular thing in the sky and you grab your iPhone and you take a picture and it looks like nothing. I mean, not that they had iPhones back then, but still. Photography doesn't necessarily capture all the nuances of things. Especially depending on the kind of equipment you have. But nonetheless, it says, newspapers published testimony from witnesses who had said they had seen extraordinary solar activity, such as the sun appearing to dance or zigzag in the sky, advance towards the earth, or emit multicolored light and radiant colors. And this event lasted for 10 minutes. Okay, and what's interesting is that this seems to have happened, sounds like it's happened potentially more than one time, because this initially happens in November 1917, and it says the local bishop opened a canonical investigation to review witness accounts and assess whether the alleged private revelations from Mary were compatible with Catholic theology. Well, that's what they always do. The local priest conducting the investigation was convinced by the concurring testimony of extraordinary solar phenomenon from secular reporters, government officials, and other skeptics in attendance. Bishop Jose da Silva declared the miracle worthy of belief on the 13th of October, 1930, permitting officially the cult of Our Lady of Fatima within the Catholic Church. Now it says, at a gathering on the 13th of October, 1951 at Fatima, the papal legate, Cardinal Federico Tedeschini, told the million people attending that on the 30th of October, the 31st, and the 1st, and the 8th November 1950, so interestingly, right around Samhain, or they would have called that All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, Pope Pius XII witnessed the miracle of the sun from the Vatican gardens. So it sounds like this was repeated in some way. The early and enduring interest in the miracle and related prophecies had a significant impact on the devotional practices of Catholics. And it says, okay, various claims were made. Many witnesses report after a period of rain, the dark clouds parted, revealing the sun as an opaque spinning disk in the sky. It was described as being significantly duller than usual, casting multicolored lights across the landscape, the people, and the surrounding clouds. The sun was then reported to have careened towards the earth before zigzagging back to its normal position. Witnesses reported their previously wet clothes became suddenly and completely dry, and the wet and muddy ground that was previously soaked from the rain that had been falling. Not all witnesses reported seeing the sun dance. Some only saw the radiant colors. A number of people, thousands according to some sources, saw nothing. Okay, so you can argue about what was seen or what was not seen. Nonetheless, the church made the decision that this was important enough, that there was a shrine built near the city of Fatima, and Pius XII approved the Fatima apparitions in 1940. 4 times during the week that he declared the dogma of the Assumption of Mary, 33 years after the actual event that was said to have occurred in Fatima, Pope Pius XII claimed to have witnessed the same miracle of the sun, as we had said. And he said he was during a walk in the Vatican gardens, he arrived at the statue of Our Lady of Lourdes and saw the miracle. He describes himself in handwritten notes as awestruck, and he saw the same miracle several other times. So, in any case, these kinds of miraculous apparitions, like other ones, tend to say that they heal people, or they do things to rejuvenate people's faith. Nonetheless, if we put all the details aside there. You're talking about a figure. If Mary is making this kind of a thing happen, and we don't know, is she doing it? Is she asking God to do it? I mean, if she's the one who's saying, I'm going to show a miracle, if you have a being who has the power to make the sun fall from the sky, then, to say that, oh no, she's not divine just seems strange. I don't know, it's, there definitely, it feels, Mary has all of the elements of it's interesting, she has all the potential elements of a kind of dark feminine figure. She has this virgin birth. So there is definitely something sacred about her. There definitely seems to be a connection to the idea of the earth and the life of the earth and the life of the fields and the sacrifice of, that which is born of the life of the fields and that then is resurrected. It gives Mary very much the feel of an earth mother. And the Black Madonna images in particular really attest to that mystery and the existence of that, that sort of underlying tone to the Mary story. The story of her just seems to be very sanitized and put within the rules and put within the correct lineages and everything else, because it had to take on this kind of mythological significance. Now, again, people who follow Mary, Carl Jung had once said that he had always talked about the quaternary, and when you talk about, in other words, the number 4 is really the whole number. Like the Trinity isn't quite enough. Jung always said that the Trinity was missing a feminine element, and that when the doctrine connected to Mary comes into play, then now you have this feminine element. But it's a weakened feminine element. It's a feminine element that's made to be subject. But a bit like if you go to pagan sites or churches that are built on pagan sites, there's definitely a sense that there is an essence of something that is there, that has been commandeered or taken over by the new religion in order to kind of put it in the box, place it in the context of whatever the new rules are, or whatever the new dogmas are, or whatever the new acceptable beliefs are about God. And I feel like Mary kind of is part of this package. There's the historical Mary, and then there's the way in which her life and her role as the mother of Jesus ends up being kind of rolled into this package where she becomes this model of submission and obedience. And of course, ultimately, everything that she does follows the rules. She's not a rule breaker. But at the same time, it's like if she can appear and command this, if this aspect of the feminine that those who are Christian can identify with, if she can appear and she can have this massive kind of power, then, certainly whatever else you might think or believe, there's definitely the sense that something else is kind of afoot underneath here. And I think the answer lies in Mary as, there's an aspect of her, of the mother archetype, that is acceptable and sanitized that we all look at, in the same way that you look at white Jesus, right? I mean, there's an aspect that is sanitized, but that, it certainly tells us that the archetype as it is presented to us culturally and by state religions and by official institutions who are using this story for some kind of political or social purpose, that the reality of it still kind of lurks underneath. So there's probably a lot more to Mary than the rather benign blue and white image that you see. There certainly there is far more power that is suggested there than the idea of this. I mean, certainly people who are comforted by the gentle, comforting image of a mother, yes, you certainly have that. But again, there's definitely a deeper mystery at play here. And it's the way in which the feminine kind of tries to, kind of like the weed, I don't want to call it a weed, but that which is cut down, and when you pave over it, the way in which it still manages to kind of sneak up through the cracks and make itself known again. That feminine element, even though it has been sanitized and put into a subordinate kind of position, it still manages to show itself. And I guess I want to end by talking a little bit about the, just to mention at least, the High Priestess card in the tarot, where you have the blue and white image of the woman who's crowned with the moon, who's not meant to be the Virgin Mary, but nonetheless, there's certainly elements of her there. And I feel like that card may encapsulate what I think of as kind of the darker, or at least the subtext of the image of the Virgin Mary. There's a great mystery behind that. There's a great feminine mystery that is behind the apparent woman who is considered to be, this chaste and obedient servant of God. She is some sort of embodiment of this feminine that yields, but that is also, her benevolent face like belies there's a deeper mystery there. Reveals itself perhaps under the right circumstances. But Mary, I think, is a figure who tends to be more revered in a mystical aspect. And that is the aspect that allows one to come into relationship rather than simply to be a tool of the dogmatic institution or of the state institution, when that certainly was the case. She doesn't represent that. She is one that in many ways, even though there's theology to explain her positioning, in some ways, everything she does is outside that theology. She's sort of made to kind of retrofit that theology into a package that sounds palatable for a religion that is really patriarchal in nature. But again, if in any aspect of Christianity that's involved in the real mystery, beyond everything, what Joseph Campbell would call the first function of mythology, that negotiating the unknown. God is the idea of, we can only say what God is not what God is. When you move into that realm of the mystery, you're moving into that realm of the Virgin Mary as well, because she tends to be venerated in those kinds of, she is the one who perhaps, if she is the one who can intercede, who they said that the path to God is through Mary, or the path to Jesus is through Mary, then this is saying that, it's the path of the feminine is the path to the divine. That's kind of the subtext there. And if you exclude that and you focus on a religion that is exclusively about scriptures and texts and books and rules, then it becomes the same kind of religion that Jesus railed against with the Pharisees, right? It's all about rules and not about compassion. So anyway, just some interesting thoughts on Mary. I hope you found this interesting. Those of you who follow me, I have shut my Patreon down because I'm going to be ending this podcast by the end of 2025. And I am also moving and starting a new career. I'm actually recording this podcast kind of in the middle of everything. But you can still find me, Katonia Podcast, one word on Instagram, Katonia Podcast, 2 words on Facebook. And I will try to update everybody about what's going on there. There's also a Katonia YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/@Katonia Podcast, one word. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.